Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, November 3rd, 2021. Congressional Republicans seeing the big wins for their party in Tuesday's elections, including the governor of Virginia, as a rejection of the president's agenda and the Democrats' push for the large social spending plans. Many Democrats say things would have been different if they had moved faster to pass a bill. President Biden applauding the start of COVID-19 vaccinations for 5 to 11-year-olds after the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention gave its final approval. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell saying the economy has recovered enough from the pandemic to start scaling back the economic aid it's provided through billions of dollars in bond purchases every month, what is now called tapering. And the Supreme Court hears a case on the Second Amendment, a challenge to a New York law that restricts the ability to carry a concealed handgun outside the home for self-defense. We'll talk with a USA Today reporter who says it's looking like the justices will modify or strike down that law. We begin with reaction to Tuesday's elections, especially for Virginia governor. Democratic candidate Terry McAuliffe officially conceding today, writing, "Congratulations to Governor-elect Glenn Youngkin on his victory. I hope Virginians will join me in wishing the best to him and his family." And also, New Jersey governor. It's still too close to call there between the Democratic incumbent Phil Murphy and the Republican challenger Jack Ciattarelli. Associated Press writing, the two states' results were particularly alarming to Democrats because of where they happened. President Joe Biden carried Virginia by 10 points last year. He took New Jersey by more than 15. Given the scale of those victories, neither state was seen as especially competitive when this year's campaigns began. Also, this from AP, the first major elections of Biden's presidency suggesting growing discontent among voters. They also underscored that with Donald Trump out of office, Democrats can't center their messages on opposition to him. On Capitol Hill, House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy at a news conference.
Oh, what a night it was. And it was a night just not about Virginia. It was a night about America. Have you heard from other members here? Virginia, New Jersey, New York, Minneapolis, Seattle, Texas. Today is a wake-up call for Washington Democrats to abandon the partisanship, the extremist agenda of Washington-based programs that cost trillions of dollars and don't have programs that nobody even wants. We have warned Speaker Pelosi almost every day that she's been in the majority this year, that her policies were wrong and not wanted. She saw it time and again. She watched school board meetings where parents would come and ask to have a say in their children's education. What was the Democratic answer? To pressure the Attorney General to go after the parents, even if your child was raped in a bathroom. We watched people fearful of the rising cost of inflation. The Democrats' answer? To spend trillions more to make you cost a tax on everyone. As we watched with the cameras as Republicans went to the border, led many times by Tony Gonzalez, with the fear of what was happening, of their new policies along the border, where more than 1.4 million people have come across, more than 160 countries. People that are on the terrorist watch list being caught, and the Democrats continued to ignore it. Crime rising across America for the cities that asked to defund the police based upon Democratic policies. Just in my home state, not far from Nancy Pelosi, our Speaker's house, 5 Walgreens closed because they could not stay open just with the theft that continues to rise. What was their answer? More of the same. Just last weekend, NBC had a poll that talked about the biggest concerns that Americans had and who was best to lead it. I think when you look at Governor-elect Youngkin, he was one that can lead because he listened. He didn't bring past politicians in. He listened to those in Virginia. Didn't matter if you were Republican, Democrat. He didn't take political consultants' advice like Terry McAuliffe. He took parents' advice.
The House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, Republican from California, a news conference today with other House Republicans. And today, the House Republican Re-Election Committee expanding its list of the House Democrats it considers vulnerable in the 2022 midterm elections when the Republicans aim to win back the majority in that chamber. First question to Kevin McCarthy was about former President Donald Trump.
What role do you think Donald Trump played in last night's election results? This morning, the former president was on a conservative radio and said he was responsible for the win. He took credit for the win in Virginia. But Youngkin kept Donald Trump at arm's length and focused on policy and not on Donald Trump. So, what's your assessment of the role that Trump played, if any?
My first was, I guess I can't be surprised the morning after Republicans win across the nation. The media wants to try to find division. I watched the Republican Party more united, more people joining it, based upon policy. Policy matters. And I think when you saw the last 10 months, the policy of the Democrats, I think people were open to trying to find something much better. And they've had that experience under a Republican majority and with President Trump in there. But I don't think after winning all these races, that's the question that would come before us. I think that's just another political ploy.
The House Republican leader, Kevin McCarthy, at a news conference. Over in the Senate, the minority leader there, Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, speaking on the Senate floor about his takeaways from the elections.
Last night was a difficult evening for Democrats. The Democratic Party has wildly misread their mandate and let the radical left run the country. Local Democrats let teachers' unions keep schools shut months longer than necessary and told parents they didn't get a say in what their kids are learning. Washington Democrats have supercharged inflation, recreated welfare without work requirements, and made America significantly less energy independent. President Biden was only given a 50-50 Senate and a tiny majority in the House, but he decided to let the radical left run the country. Citizens wanted a return to normalcy, but have gotten a never-ending series of government-created crises. So look, the American people will not stand for this. That's what voters told Democrats last night all across the country. The results from different parts of our country demonstrate that this was in large part a referendum on national issues. But it's not too late. Democrats should listen to the voters, drop this reckless taxing and spending spree, and stop trying to ram through a socialist transformation that the American people never asked for. The radical transformation that Democrats are riding behind closed doors would compound every mistake their party has made.
Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell on the Senate floor. More on the election results in a minute, but Senator McConnell talking about the social spending and tax plan the Democrats are still negotiating the final details on, expect to be passed by Democrats only eventually, especially in the Senate. Through the process called budget reconciliation, Republicans cannot block with a filibuster. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer giving an update on those negotiations on the Senate floor.
Yesterday, Democrats continued making great progress towards finalizing President Biden's Build Back Better plan. The challenges American families and workers are facing today are enormous, and President Biden's agenda is the remedy to much of their hardships. It's just what the American people want and what they need. And it's exactly why we need to focus on getting the job done, to finalize and pass this legislation and deliver help for the American people. Last night, I held another round of talks going past midnight with a number of my colleagues as we approach a final agreement. Talks with the White House, the Speaker, my Senate colleagues and chairs, and members of the House. We continue to make very good progress each day. Passing such transformative legislation is not easy, but the long hours we are putting into it will be well worth it for the American people.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, on the Senate floor. An article in The Hill reads that House Democrats have amended the enormous social spending framework at the heart of President Biden's economic agenda to include paid family leave, a popular provision that had met resistance from Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, and was thought to be removed from the package. Also, there are some talks about what to do about the state and local tax deduction for the federal level, currently capped at $10,000. House Democrats proposing in their latest bill to raise it to $72,500. Over in the Senate, there's word that Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Bob Menendez, both with the Democratic caucus, coming up with a compromise fix that would target only those making under $400,000 each year, would be permanent, unlike the House version, which is temporary, and the senators claiming it's deficit neutral, all still under negotiation. Well, Senator Joe Manchin, as mentioned earlier this week, said he needed more time to study the latest spending plan by the Democrats. Today, he's telling reporters that it is doubly the case given Republicans' victories on Tuesday in Virginia and elsewhere.
In Virginia, independents swung to Glenn Youngkin compared to 2020. What does that say about concerns you think voters might have about inflation or the scope of the BBB package, some of the things you've raised?
You can read so much into all of that last night. I mean, I think it should be a call that all of us have to be more attentive to the people back home, and I've been trying to do that from day one, and I've been saying this for many, many months. People have concerns. People are concerned. They very much so. And for us to go down the path that we've been going, and they were trying to accelerate it, and it has been slowed down, I think that we need to take our time and do it right. So you can read anything you want out of it. The bottom line is,
what do you read out of it?
We have a divided country.
What do you read out of it?
We have a divided country that needs to be united, and you can't unite it by just doing it by one-party system.
Do you think the White House has been listening to that message?
I hope so.
That's Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, talking with reporters on Capitol Hill. In another Senate office building hallway, Democratic Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia telling reporters the lessons from the Virginia governor's race is that Democrats were hurt because they did not reach an agreement on the big social spending bill. And because of that, they didn't vote on and pass the smaller $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill. Here's Senator Kaine.
Look, congressional Dems hurt Terry McAuliffe. I mean, I'm going to be blunt. It's humbling to say it, but if we had been able to deliver infrastructure and reconciliation in mid-October, he could have sold universal pre-K, affordable child care, infrastructure, creating jobs. And you know what? We're going to get both of these bills. It's been obvious to me for at least a month we're going to get a deal, but we're going to get it, probably at the end of November. And having suffered the loss in Virginia and really narrow result in New Jersey, now we have a tough narrative that we have to face. So Democrats control both houses, and they have to act like they have to be disciplined, have to get results. And the, our inability to come together and get a result hurt him. So,
but you guys are also trying to pass major social policy changes.
True.
That, backed by the progressives in your party. Did you guys try to do too much? Are you sure your message isn't that they rejected these policy changes you were trying to push through?
No, they would absolutely love, like pre-K and child care. Are you kidding me? That's exactly what suburban parents are hungry for, especially after a tough pandemic.
So you don't think you have any second?
No, we should. Look, politics is about timing, and we blew it on the timing. Senator Warren and I explained to our colleagues beginning in late September that, look, we're going to get a deal here. We need to get a deal. But the virtue of getting one now is you can help Virginia. And if you help Virginia, you help yourself in the midterms. This has made the midterms more challenging, but it is potentially a ghost of Christmas future experience. You can see a bad future, but you have the opportunity to change it. I hope the Dems will, let's get the lead out and get both of these bills passed.
So do you blame Manchin then for this loss?
I'm saying it's on all of us. It's on progressives who wanted to be too purist. It's on moderates who wanted to be too purist. It's on the House who wanted it their way and the Senate who wanted it their way. You got to be able to make a deal and deliver results. And we delivered a great result for the American public, the American Rescue Plan. That was 8 months ago. They want more results, and we got to deliver. Because we are the majority, and they expect us to deliver.
So. What do you say to some Democrats who say that Terry McAuliffe was just a bad candidate?
I disagree. Terry McAuliffe was a very popular governor. and in ways that could be popular with moderates and progressives too. More voting rights restoration. Anybody in the history of the United States, great civil rights track record, best state for business. Good business track record. He was a solid candidate. I think it was on the shoulders of Democrats here who have the majority. People had a lot of hope for Joe Biden and the Joe Biden agenda, but Democrats didn't want to give Biden a win. He went overseas meeting with global leaders. It would have been great for him to go with a win, but people got to learn how to cut a deal and deliver.
Do you have any concerns that
any end to this in sight, do you think?
Oh, I think we'll have a deal by Thanksgiving, and then we'll say it'll be exactly a deal that we could have gotten done in early October.
Any concerns
yes.
that moderates will read this differently and walk away from this now?
No. Because I'm a moderate in the caucus. They're going to read it like I'm reading it.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Senator Tim Kaine, Virginia Democrat, with reporters today on Capitol Hill. President Joe Biden also asked about the election results, and in particular in Virginia, where the Republican won the governor's race.
All the way at the end.
Thank you, Mr. President. Appreciate it.
Well, you're not all the way at the end, but that's okay. You're up.
As leader of the Democratic Party, how much responsibility do you take for the dismal results in Virginia and beyond last night?
Well, look, yesterday reminded me of that one of the sacred rights we have is to be able to go out and cast our votes. And remember that we all have an obligation to accept the legitimacy of these elections. I was talking to Terry to congratulate him today. He got 600,000 more votes than any Democrat ever has gotten. We brought out every Democrat about there was, more votes than ever has been cast for a Democratic incumbent. I'm not incumbent, a Democrat running for governor. And no governor in Virginia has ever won when he's of the same or he or she's the same party as the sitting president. What I do know is, that people want us to get things done. They want us to get things done. And that's why I'm continuing to push very hard for the Democratic Party to move along and pass my infrastructure bill and my Build Back Better bill. I think if we, think about what we're talking about here. People are upset and uncertain about a lot of things, from COVID to school to jobs to a whole range of things, and the cost of a gallon of gasoline. And so if I'm able to sign into law, my Build Back Better initiative, I'm in a position where you're going to see a lot of those things ameliorated quickly and swiftly. So that has to be done.
Mr. President, given what you said, do you take some responsibility, and do you think that Terry McAuliffe would have won if your agenda had passed before Election Day?
Well, I think it should have passed before Election Day, but I'm not sure that I would be able to have changed the number of very conservative folks who turned out in the red districts who were Trump voters, but maybe.
President Joe Biden earlier today. With more on the elections in the governor of Virginia, C-SPAN, and also New Jersey, C-SPAN spoke with Leah Askarinam, hotline editor with National Journal.
Temperature check on the national environment. We had a sense that Democrats were struggling given Biden's sinking approval numbers, a trend that we've seen in multiple polls for months. And now we have a bit more confirmation in actual election results. We have Glenn Youngkin, who, the Republican, won the Virginia governor's race. Not exactly a shock, given that the polls were actually pretty accurate in projecting the official outcome, though, we look at polling more as a snapshot in time. But either way, it looks like it was a toss-up race as we went into last night. And early this morning, late last night, we saw Glenn Youngkin give a really kind of positive message victory speech. So I think it's going to be fascinating to see how he governs a state that maybe isn't quite as blue as we thought it would be, but definitely a bluish purple at this point.
New Jersey, last year, President Biden won by 16 points. It's a tied race right now. Do you have an update for us?
Well, I'd caution against calling it a tied race just because we don't know what the final results are going to be. So it's, a tied race, the way votes are being counted as we speak. I think it's going to be a much closer race than what any of the kind of major polls expected. Again, this wasn't a race that was as competitive as Virginia. And so there's not as much polling of this race. So we've seen a kind of range in what this result could have been. At this point, it looks like Phil Murphy is going to win. Again, that hasn't been called, not official yet, but the trends are going in his direction. But if he does, it's, a Democratic governor should win New Jersey. New Jersey is a blue state. It's not Virginia where, maybe it's recently blue. So it's a real omen for Democrats who have struggled in the public eye, struggled in the kind of media narrative that we've seen, especially as Biden has struggled and Democrats have struggled to pass his signature Build Back Better legislation. And this was a real reality check that these things have consequences. I'll also add that in Virginia, particularly, it's pretty common for the party that is not the president's party to win the governor's mansion after the presidential election. So I also want to point out that while the climate is certainly not looking good for Democrats right now, there's only so much within their control. This is the first midterm, or we are approaching the first midterm of a new president. Democrats have control of the presidency and Congress for the first time. They are governing during a pandemic, which has major impacts on all sorts of issues that voters care about, including the economy and education. And we're seeing, that this is going to be a referendum, not on, most improved, but on what the state of the country is right now. And I think it's pretty clear that this is a pretty tough time for a lot of Americans and a lot of people around the world.
Leah Askaranam is hotline editor with National Journal, joining C-SPAN on the Washington Journal program Wednesday morning. New Jersey does not have an automatic recount law, but candidates there are permitted to request one. Also on the subject of voting, the U.S. Senate today voted not to take up the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which supporters say would fight voter suppression and restore parts of the 1965 Voting Rights Act modified by recent Supreme Court decisions. The vote in the Senate was 50-49, short of the 60 votes needed to move forward. One Republican voted yes, and that was Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. Also a note that the Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, a Democrat, changed his vote from yes to no for procedural reasons. It allows him to call this up for another vote in the future. So far this year, 4 different times a voting rights bill brought forth by the Democrats, blocked by the Republicans in the Senate. U.S. Supreme Court today heard arguments in a case about the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. It was a challenge from a gun owners group in New York to a state law restricting the carrying of concealed handguns outside the home for self-defense. Attorney Paul Clement represented the association.
The text of the Second Amendment enshrines a right not just to keep arms, but to bear them. And the relevant history and tradition, exhaustively surveyed by this court in the Heller decision, confirm that the text protects an individual right to carry firearms outside the home for purposes of self-defense. Indeed, that history is so clear that New York no longer contests that carrying a handgun outside of the home for purposes of self-defense is constitutionally protected activity. But that concession dooms New York's law, which makes it a crime for a typical law-abiding New Yorker to exercise that constitutional right. This court in Heller labeled the very few comparable laws that restricted all outlets for carrying firearms outside the home for self-defense outliers that were rightly condemned in decisions like Nunn against Georgia. New York likens its law to a restriction on weapons in sensitive places. But the difference between a sensitive place law and New York's regime is fundamental. It is the difference between regulating constitutionally protected activity and attempting to convert a fundamental constitutional right into a privilege that can only be enjoined by those who can demonstrate to the satisfaction of a government official that they have an atypical need for the exercise of that right. That is not how constitutional rights work.
Attorney Paul Clement at today's Supreme Court oral argument, the case New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. Many of the justices asking him when it was reasonable for a state to restrict concealed carry. Here is Justice Elena Kagan.
But I think what the Chief Justice is trying to do is figure out how those cash out in the real world. So I'll give you a few more. New York City subways.
So, I think that the question of whether you could restrict arms in the subways, you'd have to go through the analysis, I think, and say, is there restriction on access generally? I suppose.
No, I got the analysis, all three parts of it. Like, how does it cash out? What does it mean?
I don't know how those are going to cash out in particular cases, because I think the way that you would normally deal with that is you'd look at all the briefing we had in this case on the history of these various things. And so, on behalf of my individual clients, I suppose I could give away the subway because they're not looking to go, they're not in Manhattan, they're in Rensselaer County.
The Chief Justice started with universities, and you said that would be all right. Did you mean that?
Yeah, yes, I did mean that.
Because that's open for, anybody can walk around the NYU campus.
Well, NYU doesn't have much of a campus.
I would go back to New York, and I think you'll find that that's wrong. Similarly, the Columbia campus.
Columbia's got a campus, and I don't know whether they restrict access at all. And maybe if they don't restrict access to parts of the campus, maybe those are parts of the campus where they wouldn't enforce the policy anyways. The point I'm trying to make,
but you can't say, there are 50,000 people in one place, a ballpark. There are 50,000 people in one place. They're all on top of each other. We don't want guns there. That's you couldn't, the city or the state couldn't do that?
I think they might well be able to, because again, you can't get into Yankee Stadium without a ticket. I'd have to understand many of these, I don't know every jurisdiction. I don't know enough about Yankee Stadium, but a lot of these stadiums are not run by the government anyway. So if a private entity wants to restrict access, I don't know where the state action is for there to be a second.
Suppose the state says no protest or event that has more than 10,000 people.
I think that might be trickier. Maybe they could justify that under strict scrutiny, but I don't think that would be a sensitive places.
Attorney Paul Clement and Justice Elena Kagan. And with more on today's Supreme Court case, we're joined by USA Today Supreme Court correspondent John Fritze. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
From the justices' questioning, could you tell which way they were leaning on this New York law?
Yeah, I think even before we walked into arguments, given the 6-3 conservative majority on the court, I think it was pretty clear that New York's law is in peril. I think the question is, how far does the court go, and what are the implications for other laws across the country? There are only about 5 or 6 states that have laws that are pretty close to what New York has. But the real question here, I think, is does the court set some kind of a standard that will guide lower courts when they're deciding the constitutionality of other gun regulations? That's the real place where I think this case could have an impact. So based on the questioning, yeah, I think it's pretty clear that you have a majority looking to do something with this law to undermine it at least and strike it down potentially. And I do think that particularly like a Justice Kavanaugh seemed to be searching for a way to do that narrowly. And so the real question here is how broad or narrow is the outcome.
A lot was made of the landmark Heller decision that recognized the right to own a firearm for self-defense. Could this case modify that in any way?
Well, that's the real thing, right? Heller basically said, Heller and subsequently McDonald, which came 2 years later, and basically applied the holding in Heller to states. Heller struck down a D.C. District of Columbia law that prohibited having a handgun and really focused on the ability to have a handgun at home. The court said that it was a fundamental right of the Second Amendment to have a handgun at home for self-protection, for self-defense. And it also sort of critically said that it was an individual right? Like up until that point, there was some question about, is the Second Amendment right a right for an individual or is it right for a militia? given that that is a word that's contained in the Second Amendment. And Heller, one of its most important holdings is that there's an individual right to own a handgun at home for self-defense. But Heller did not get into, well, what happens when you take that gun and walk out your front door with it? And that's really what we're talking about now with the New York case. Does that right under the Second Amendment to have self-defense extend beyond the home and into public spaces? And if it does, then what sort of rights do states and cities have to restrict where you take it? There was a lot of question during oral argument about, can you bring it into Yankee Stadium? Can you bring it onto the New York City subway? Can you bring it onto an airplane? That didn't come up, but that's along the lines. Justice Barrett asked about, what about Times Square on New Year's Eve? There was a lot of questions about, all right, if you allow people to walk around with guns, does the state have some ability to limit that right in places where it may have a legitimate interest in public safety?
We're talking with John Fritze, USA Today Supreme Court correspondent. Sometimes during the Supreme Court oral arguments, they go back to the Founding Fathers' intent, and that refers to the United States. In this case, you wrote that they brought up a law that's 700 years old. What's that about?
Yeah, so this is, I think, a fascinating point. Most of the listeners will know that the conservatives on the court have long embraced this idea of originalism. And what that means is that in places in the Constitution where it may not be clear what the framers meant, you have to go back and sort of parse the meaning of the Constitution for how the framers may have thought about it. In other words, what these words meant at the time the Constitution was being written. And one of the ways that the court often does that is it looks to common law, it looks to sort of colonial law, it looks to what the law was saying back before there was a United States, perhaps in England. And there's a fascinating statute from the 14th century that really came up a lot in the briefings. One of the first known areas where there is an ability to regulate the carrying of guns. And what the law says is that nobody can go out into public, heavily populated places like markets and fairs and so forth with a gun. So there's been a huge debate about that, in part because the colonies, it's fascinating to see that this old language from this old law from the 14th century is almost word for word in some of the colonial laws. And in North Carolina actually still has on the books some provision of this that looks very much like the Statute of Northampton. And so, there was this debate that was sort of raging in the briefs about, well, what did that mean and what are its implications for the Second Amendment? Statute of Northampton did come up in oral arguments, and I think it is an issue. However, several of the justices, I think, noted that, look, what we care about most is what was happening at the time that the Second Amendment was crafted and the time that it became applicable to the states. And so, maybe we don't have to look quite that far back.
USA Today Supreme Court correspondent John Fritze. Read his work at usatoday.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And you can find the video, but actually just the audio. It's only audio from the Supreme Court of this case and all the cases from the Supreme Court at our website, cspan.org. And Washington Today continues in a minute.
And this is for all nonfiction book readers out there. Check out the new C-SPAN podcast, About Books. Each episode delves into news about the publishing industry, reports on bestsellers, trends, and book reviews. Now, this week's episode features former longtime president and publisher of Regnery Books, Margie Ross. She discusses the cancel culture in the publishing industry. We'll also look at some new nonfiction books by members of Congress, including Trump impeachment manager Adam Schiff of California. The About Books podcast. Find it and follow it wherever you get your podcasts, including on the new C-SPAN Now app.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. Another story from Associated Press. The U.S. enters a new phase Wednesday in its COVID-19 vaccination campaign, with shots now available to millions of elementary-age children in what health officials hailed as a major breakthrough after more than 18 months of illness, hospitalizations, deaths, and disrupted education. With the federal government promising enough vaccine to protect the nation's 28 million kids ages 5 to 11, pediatricians' offices, pharmacies, hospitals, schools, and health clinics were poised to begin the shots after the final okay late Tuesday. President Biden speaking about this at the White House.
For parents all over this country, this is a day of relief and celebration. After almost 18 months of anxious worrying every time your child had a sniffle or started to cough, well, you can now protect them from this horrible virus, because that would always worry you that was coming along. 28 million more young Americans are now eligible for the protection of a vaccine. And my administration is ready. We're ready from day one, today, organized and have a plan for this vaccination's launch. As soon as next week, we'll have enough vaccine and enough places, and parents will be able to schedule appointments to get their kids their first shot. And we've already secured enough vaccine supply for every single child in America ages 5 through 11. And weeks ago, we asked states and pharmacies to put together their detailed plan to start placing their orders for these specially formulated vaccines for young children. We started packing and shipping these orders last week as soon as the FDA authorized the vaccine. We've already sent millions of doses, millions of doses, and millions more to come by next week. These doses will be available at approximately, I beg your pardon, I swallowed wrong. Will be available at approximately 20,000 locations around the country. These include places that parents know and trust, their local pharmacies, their pediatricians, family doctors, and children's hospitals. Many of the vaccine sites will offer times on nights and weekends so parents can take their children to get vaccinated after work and after school.
President Joe Biden back in Washington after his trip to Europe. Pfizer, and that's the vaccine for those young kids that's been approved, says it expects to make 19,000 shipments totaling 11 million doses in the next several days, and millions more available to order on a weekly basis. Some polls showing, though, that perhaps only about one-third of parents will immediately get their young children vaccinated. The CDC Director, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, saying today she understands some parents may have questions.
With this new recommendations, I know parents have questions. As a parent myself, I understand the need to have as much information as possible to ensure our decisions are in the best interests of our children. I encourage parents with questions to talk to their children's pediatrician, their school nurse, and their local pharmacist or other trusted source to learn more about this vaccine and its benefits and to get answers to your questions. Get the information you need to make the best decision for your child. And let's take a moment to commemorate today, this moment, that we can bring protection to our children.
That's the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, at today's White House COVID-19 virtual briefing with reporters. Also on the call, the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who said parents need to watch for bad advice.
Now, while a vaccine for kids is a landmark positive development in the face of these challenges, I want to warn parents about the wave of misinformation about COVID-19 and vaccines that is coming their way. Many parents are already seeing inaccurate claims on social media, text threads, and in their inboxes. Now, I believe every parent has a right to the facts so they can make decisions for their children based on accurate scientific information. Misinformation robs them of this freedom. That's why I'm asking parents to please seek answers from credible sources like their doctor, their local hospital, their local health department, or the CDC. On a personal note, I just want to say that my wife and I will be taking our 5-year-old son to get vaccinated, and we will be so grateful that we can more confidently send him out into the world, knowing that he has strong protection against COVID-19. Ultimately, we want every child in our country to be safe from COVID and to be able to get back to the lives they love. Sleepovers and birthday parties, school plays and soccer games, visits with friends and grandparents, and so much more. And that's why we must do everything we can to support parents as they consider vaccinating their children.
U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy. The vaccine for the younger kids is 1/3 the dose given to older children and adults. It's injected with smaller sized needles, and it requires 2 doses 3 weeks apart, plus 2 more weeks for full protection. A story from Fox News, more than 36 Senate Republicans are moving to formally disapprove and nullify President Biden's vaccine mandate on private employees under the Congressional Review Act, the official process for Congress to eliminate an executive branch rule. The formal rule from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, expected to be released soon, and it will cover companies with 100 or more workers. One of the Senate Republicans at today's news conference, Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee.
The American people, and indeed Tennesseans, are not anti-vax. What they are is anti-socialism. And what they see happening with this vaccine mandate, this one-size-fits-all, government going to tell you what to do, how to do, when to do, they see this as a part of the Democrats' agenda to take control of your life, cradle to grave, daylight to dark, 24/7, 365. And they're pushing back. And thank goodness that they are. And I'm grateful that Senator Braun is leading this effort to help push back on behalf of the American people. They do not want a one-size-fits-all mandate that is going to adversely impact 80 million workers. Now, this is at a time when we have 10.4 million jobs that are unfilled. And we have families that are struggling to come back from the pandemic, and people that are trying to get back to work. And in order to push this socialist agenda, this government control of health care, what do? A one-size-fits-all vaccine mandate that says if you don't get the jab, Joe Biden is going to get you fired from your job. And that's the message that they're sending, that the vaccine and getting a shot is more important than you being able to provide for your family. The vaccine and getting a shot is more important to the Democrats than you being able to talk to your doctor to make a decision if this is going to be right for you.
Senator Marsha Blackburn at a news conference with other Republican lawmakers. Once OSHA publishes the formal private sector vaccine mandate rule in the Federal Registry, then the Congressional Review Act allows a vote in Congress to overturn it. But that resolution can be vetoed by President Biden, which would be likely. So it really needs a veto override majority, and that would be 2/3 of the House and Senate to get rid of the rule. A Senate floor vote on this, though, is expected in December. Vaccine mandates for essential public safety employees has been a hot topic lately as some firefighters, police officers, hospital workers resist getting a vaccine, sometimes then being put on unpaid leave. Today, the head of the Federal Aviation Administration, Stephen Dixon, was asked by Senator John Tester, Democrat of Montana, about air traffic controllers.
Do you anticipate losing any air traffic controllers once the mandate takes effect? And what are you doing to make sure that we have enough traffic controllers in our towers?
Well, thank you for the question, Senator Tester. And as I said a moment ago, we have dealt with people issues throughout the pandemic. Sure. And the safety and health of my workforce is at the top of the list in terms of being able to serve the public in air traffic control operations. I do not anticipate, there is certainly potentially progressive discipline processes if we get to that point. But at this point, I do not anticipate, I'm not hearing about any particular issues with respect to air traffic controller staffing, but it's something that we are focused on a daily basis.
So do you have what percentage of air traffic controllers are vaccinated right now?
The data is incomplete. The requirement for the controllers to attest, it's a very manual process, and the reporting is uneven around the system. So I don't have an accurate metric to share at this point.
So that's a problem. And it's a problem if I don't know. It's a bigger problem if you don't know it, and that you don't know what the exposure is here if you don't know how many people are not vaccinated. Does that make sense to you?
That's correct, yes.
So what, are you doing anything special that's been effective in encouraging folks to get vaccinated?
We're working very closely with our labor partners to encourage, we're encouraging broadly. The Secretary and I are sending regular updates and encouraging the workforce to do the right thing and get their vaccines. And we will continue to do that on down to the individual basis as we go forward.
It's a concern, I think, could be a real train wreck if you're not on top of it.
Senator John Tester questioning the FAA Administrator Steve Dixon at today's Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee hearing. This is Washington Today. From NBC News, the Federal Reserve concluded a pivotal meeting of its rate-setting body today with a commitment to leave interest rates near zero, along with an announcement that later this month it will start unwinding one of the biggest and most unprecedented market interventions undertaken in the wake of the pandemic. The Fed Chair Jerome Powell making this announcement at a news conference.
The Fed's policy actions have been guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people, along with our responsibilities to promote the stability of the financial system. Our asset purchases have been a critical tool. They helped preserve financial stability early in the pandemic, and since then have helped foster smooth market functioning and accommodative financial conditions to support the economy. Last December, the committee stated its intention to continue asset purchases at a pace of at least $120 billion per month until substantial further progress has been made toward our maximum employment and price stability goals. At today's meeting, the committee judged that the economy has met this test and decided to begin reducing the pace of its asset purchases. Beginning later this month, we will reduce the monthly pace of our net asset purchases by $10 billion for Treasury securities and $5 billion for agency mortgage-backed securities. We also announced another reduction of this size in the monthly purchase pace starting in mid-December, since that month's purchase schedule will be released by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York prior to our December FOMC meeting. If the economy evolves broadly as expected, we judge that similar reductions in the pace of net asset purchases will likely be appropriate each month, implying that increases in our securities holdings would cease by the middle of next year. That said, we are prepared to adjust the pace of purchases if warranted by changes in the economic outlook. And even after our balance sheet stops expanding, our holdings of securities will continue to support accommodative financial conditions. Our decision today to begin tapering our asset purchases does not imply any direct signal regarding our interest rate policy. We continue to articulate a different and more stringent test for the economic conditions that would need to be met before raising the federal funds rate.
The Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell at a news conference. More from the NBC News article. Since June 2020, the central bank has been purchasing $120 billion in bonds, $80 billion in treasuries, and $40 billion in mortgage-backed securities every month to add liquidity and keep the financial system working efficiently. Wall Street reaction, the Dow up 104, NASDAQ up 161, S&P up 29. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, is ordering all federal agencies to immediately start patching hundreds of cyber vulnerabilities, many of them several years old, with an accompanying warning that bad actors are still looking to hack U.S. critical infrastructure. CISA's Director Jen Easterly testifying today before the House Homeland Security Committee.
This morning, we issued a new binding operational directive that fundamentally changes how the federal civilian government addresses vulnerabilities being actively exploited by our adversaries. Under this directive, federal agencies must now fix vulnerabilities identified by CISA within specified timeframes and update their security programs to effectively account for these requirements. This directive will significantly improve the federal government's vulnerability management practices and degrade our adversaries' ability to exploit known vulnerability. And while the only covers federal civilian agencies, we strongly recommend that every network defender review the known vulnerabilities posted publicly at CISA.gov and prioritize urgent remediation. And I was gratified to see significant support for this directive to include from this committee.
CISA Director Jen Easterly at a hearing of the House Homeland Security Committee. Those federal agencies have 6 months to patch vulnerabilities discovered before this year, 2 weeks to patch those discovered this year. An update from the Pentagon on a U.S. drone strike that killed 10 civilians in Kabul, Afghanistan in August, those 10 including children. It was during that final week of U.S. troop withdrawal. Air Force Inspector General Lieutenant General Sami Saeed saying that commanders mistakenly and honestly believe they were targeting an ISIS operative.
The authorities and rules of engagement utilized to execute this regrettable strike were understandable, and they were understandable based on the information available at the time and the perceived very high threat to U.S. forces at HKIA. The investigation found no violation of law, including the law of war. Did find execution errors confirmed by combined with confirmation bias and communication breakdowns that regrettably led to civilian casualties.
General Sami Saeed, Air Force Inspector General, in the Pentagon briefing room. Thanks for listening today. For more Washington top stories, subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter, Word for Word, at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.